Hey, Bastich B for 64K, and today we're going to have a look at the entire Strike series from Electronic Arts. And before we start looking at all these games individually, let's have a brief overview of the entire series. The Strike games were a series of isometric flight action games released by Electronic Arts between 1992 and 1997 and consisted of 5 games in the series, a trilogy on the 16 bits and 2 more on the 32 bits. They all put you in the role of a pilot of an advanced helicopter going on some crazy mission trying to stop an insane madman in some political hotspot around the world. Each game's story related to some sort of world event that was or is taking place, giving the stories a topical feel and a sense of realism, even though the stories were pretty tongue-in-cheek, gung-ho kind of stuff. All the games were designed, programmed, and directed by the duo of Mike Posehn and John Manley, who we'll be looking into in more detail. And with that out of the way, let's jump back to the early 90s for the original trilogy. Desert Strike burst onto the gaming scene in 1992 on the Sega Genesis courtesy of Electronic Arts. The game's development got going in 1990 with then EA president Trip Hawkins chatting to designer Mike Posehn and asking him to create a new game in the mold of Choplifter, one of Trip's favorite games. Mike was initially taken back by the offer, as he had worked for Electronic Arts previously in 1985 designing Deluxe Video for the Amiga, but he had never actually made a game before, and on top of that he wasn't even a fan of the then current linear platform style games that were ruling the consoles at the time. But despite that, he decided to go for it and started programming by himself immediately. I worked for 1 year on my own creating the game engine for what became Desert Strike. During the second year of development, I worked with John Manley of EA to build out the game. I wrote all the code for the game engine and the world builder. John was the creative force behind the plot and the fun factor. We worked together strategizing ways to fit the plot into the game mechanics. John Manley worked at EA and was a hardcore gamer and helped with the technical design and was the man behind the stories and writing of the entire Strike series. The one thing Mark didn't want was a linear game. He wanted it to be more open, sandbox in style, with you able to take things on as you wished. I wanted an open play field where the player was free to roam the world and discover by trial and error how to progress in the game. The trick was to design the game AI and hints to nudge the player in the right direction. And now onto the game itself, which was an isometric helicopter action strategy game which mixed open world arcade style elements and large doses of strategy and planning. It was very different to any console game out at that time. The story for the game was heavily inspired by the 1990 Gulf War, with you, a hotshot military pilot, taking on a mission to stop General Kill Baba, a parody of Saddam Hussein, after he takes over the Arab Emirates and starts producing nuclear bombs which he plans to launch at the USA. You're sent in to take him out. There are 4 main campaigns in total, but each one is made up of many smaller missions and side quests. You have the freedom to go around the whole map blasting and checking things out and even completing missions or side missions, but will have to complete all the mini missions to progress the story and end the campaign. I thought you should be able to move freely about the world and just blow things up if that's what you wanted, but we had to have some way to progress through the level, so John and I came up with the mini missions and this snafu system. Each level had a main objective that you accomplished by completing a series of mini missions. When a mini mission was completed, the enemy AI became a little less effective. For example, an enemy's missile system range and accuracy would decrease after you shot up the nearby radar installation. The missions were logical and practical. For example, take out the enemy's radar system, then hit up the electrical grid and communications before rescuing some hostages. You had a map with full mission info, location of targets, and your all-important supplies. You needed to keep refueling to keep flying, pick up armor to fix damage, and of course pick up ammo supplies, both hidden all over the map or from some of your POW drop-off points. You were also equipped with a winch to pick up civilians, down pilots, and other hostages, and came equipped with 3 types of weapons: a machine gun, a smaller fast-moving hydro rockets for taking out vehicles missiles and watchtowers, and bigger, stronger Hellfire rockets for tanks and more intense situations. When you initially start the game, you also get the choice of a wingman. Each has their own strengths and weaknesses, and as you progress through the game, you'll have the opportunity to rescue other pilots, which can be used on further missions. The objectives themselves were fun and varied: knock out strategic targets, escort missions, rescues, etc, etc. Gameplay was excellent, with the perspective giving you a great view of the battlefield and allowing you to pull off some great maneuvering with the slick momentum of your helicopter. Graphics were also excellent, well animated and detailed, with a fantastic intro setting up the story and plenty of cutscenes throughout the game to advance the big plot points. One of the artists on the game was Amy Hennig, who would later go on to work on massive franchises like the Legacy of Kain series and the Uncharted games. The music was absolutely rocking, with one of the most memorable tunes on any Genesis game provided by Commodore 64 veteran Rob Hubbard, who had joined EA a few years earlier. His main score would be remixed for the rest of the 16-bit versions in various forms. All of these things combined to make a dynamite game, and one of my most well-played Genesis games back then. The game was a massive success for Electronic Arts upon release, becoming their biggest selling game ever up until that point. Not bad for Mark, as it was his first video game ever. The critical reception was just as positive, with the game receiving rave reviews across the board in every publication. It did take some flack for supposedly profiting on the Gulf War situation at the time, with even certain UK stores pulling the game off retail shelves. Of course, John Manley and I were inspired by events in the Middle East. Our original script working title was Beirut Breakout. We were surprised when CNN had a news report saying that Desert Strike was a game about the first Gulf War. Of course, there was no such connection in our minds, but the game's story was about a military dictator in a desert region. I suppose it was good publicity regardless, and only helped game sales. Overall, it was brilliant, and Mark's basic gameplay and design would remain almost completely intact for the entire series, which brings us to the inevitable sequel. With great success, a sequel will always follow. Jungle Strike hit the Genesis 1 year after Desert in 1993. Pretty much cementing the series' legacy for the foreseeable future. Mark and John were both back, with Mark again on programming and using Desert's excellent bass engine, and John taking on lead designer and director for the game, as he explains his role. This included devising specific gameplay missions to creating the storyline, and collaborating with Mark Posen to implement the levels and new features. The plot this time has Kill Baba's son teaming up with a South American drug lord, Carlos Ortega, in a mad attempt to nuke Washington, D.C. Kill Baba as revenge for his dad's death in the original Desert Strike, and Ortega as payback for the US interfering with his lucrative drug trade. It was another plot steeped in facts, with a real tongue-in-cheek delivery, and was very topical for the time. Jungle took everything that made Desert so memorable and amplified it by 200%. There were now a massive amount of varied locations, from Washington DC, snow-capped mountains, jungle swamps, and massive enemy compounds. It truly opened up the variety in a huge way. Gameplay was pretty much exactly the same though. Do mini missions that lead up to the big level story point. Side missions include rescuing pilots, which again makes them available to choose later as co-pilots. You had your map to strategize your attack and manage resources. All these things were still available. The biggest change, however, was the opportunity to jump into multiple vehicles, which let you ride a motorbike, man an experimental hovercraft, and even jump into the seat of a F-117 stealth bomber. They all had their unique learning curves to adjust to, but were really fun additions to the gameplay. The hovercraft and bomber especially, with the fast maneuvering and the slow, precise bombing runs of the F-117. It was a welcome addition to give a little break from all that chopper action. Having said all that, this game is definitely much harder than Desert, and you'll have to use all your skills you learn from it if you ever want to see this game all the way to the end. Overall, the graphics were vastly improved, with tons of variety and lots of great cinematic cutscenes. The level design was clever and fun to explore. The music this time by Brian Schmidt, who had worked with Rob Hubbard on the original, was now lead, and he does a great great remix of the original as well as some other great topical tunes. The gameplay was on point, with the extra vehicles adding that nice touch of variety. For me overall personally, it's still my favorite of the entire series. And here's John on what him and Mark wanted to achieve with this sequel. We wanted to take what players liked about Desert and give them a wide variety of locations, missions and vehicles. Desert took place in one environment, so in Jungle we wanted to give players a chance to visit multiple other terrains and control a variety of vehicles and different weapons. Overall, the game sold over 500,000 copies initially and was another well-received game in the press. It was a massive success for EA yet again, which obviously set in motion the immediate third game in the series. Urban Strike was released in 1994 on the Sega Genesis. For the third year in a row, the series was back on your TVs with all the helicopter action you could handle. The team of Posen and Manley delivered their third game together for Electronic Arts. The story for this one took place in the then future of 2001 with a failed president-elect millionaire, H.R. Malone, trying to sway the American public opinion to his ideal through his various media outlets he owns. All the while, he's secretly building a weapon which he wants to use to send the US government into chaos and then swoop in and seize control. The big twist being that Malone is actually Carlos Ortega from Jungle Strike, who survived and got plastic surgery. You know, that old chestnut. Urban ticked all the boxes of a Strike game at that point, but somehow it just seemed all too samely. For me, Strike fatigue had set in when I originally bought this game, and played a few levels and then just stopped. It was a case of too many games in far too short a time span. But in retrospect though, Urban is quite a good game. It's my least favorite of the 16-bits, no doubt, but overall it still delivers a great cinematic action strategy experience, just not as memorable as the ones that came before. The gameplay is exactly the same as the previous titles, so we'll move on to the setting, which as the name suggests takes place over many urban areas. Big cities such as Hawaii, Las Vegas, Mexico, San Francisco and New York all make an appearance with 10 massive levels overall to tackle. The one major difference with Urban now was letting you exit the helicopter for a series of on-foot run-and-gun styled missions. According to Mark, EA insisted on these being in the game, which he wasn't all that jazzed about. I didn't like the direction EA was pushing for it. EA was pushing for the player to exit the vehicle and interact on the ground. A bad idea in my view. These missions, like the helicopter stages, were asymmetric in nature, with you having a gun and rockets to take out turrets, terrorists and blow up targets of interest. I really liked the change up in gameplay, but overall it felt a bit awkward controlling your player, and the gameplay felt like it was always whoever shot first would win. A bit unbalanced and clunky. I think having on-foot missions was a cool idea. It just doesn't quite come together as well as you'd hope. Overall, I think this game is still good and ends the 16-bit trilogy well. It's not the best of the three, but the bar was set pretty high from the start. The graphics are great, there's a real nice variety to the levels, just like Jungle Strike. The music, this time by Don Baker, a EA sound veteran who also worked on the entire Road Rash series, delivers the goods with a familiar but still engaging soundtrack. And John's story overall sort of predicted the future in so many ways, including the in-game Twin Towers attack that took place in 2001, game time, and became an actual reality in 2001, many years later. The reviews overall were still good, but most publications had the same opinion, with Next Generation magazines summing things up quite neatly, saying, with all the great scenery, Urban Strike should be the best Strike game yet, but there's nothing new in the gameplay department, which is a shame. This ultimately led the series to go on hiatus for a good few years. And now with the original trilogy complete, we're going to jump to the mid-90s and jump a generation for the last two entries.
Terrorists and madmen have created a whole new world disorder.
Soviet Strike was released in 1996, more than 2.5 years after Urban, but the series was back for a new generation, with the PlayStation being the lead platform this time. But the road to its release was extremely rocky and full of pitfalls. Soviet was originally supposed to be a 3DO title, as EA was obviously its biggest supporter, as it was Trip Hawkins' baby. But with the demise of the system, the team had to make some major changes. The PS1 was chosen as the launch system, and the long development cycle was due to the whole game being rewritten and retooled. Mike Poston was heavily involved with the original 3DO version, which had a small team behind it, but once it was decided to upgrade the game to the PS1 and increase the team, Mike was no longer interested. John Manley stayed on, however, as main game designer, with Don Baker back on music and sound duties. The game's plot, just like its predecessors, is steeped in world events. With the fall of the Soviet Union, there was now a power vacuum in Eastern Europe, and a former KGB big shot, Yuri Vatsanov, is gonna try and take advantage of that and form a coup to take down the Russian government. A lot of the previous game's tongue-in-cheek humor is gone, replaced with a cold, more realistic tone, all told through really well-made and put together full-motion video sequences.
Strike. This is Nick Arnold. I've been taken prisoner with several other agents. They're having some not-so-nice Q&A sessions and using the firing squad like it's a St. Valentine's Day massacre. Now get us out quick!
That look like they are trying their damnedest to replicate almost any movie out of Tony Scott's later career, like Domino, Enemy of the State, or even Man on Fire. It has that same schizo editing and in-your-face production.
Sorry to interrupt. Now I don't make the news, I just report it. We got a problem.
Which is?
A mothballed Soviet fleet is making for the Black Sea.
It's Grand Theft aircraft carrier, and Vladimir Ceausescu will be behind it.
Which actually works quite well in this military-style context. The humor is not lost though, with many little touches during gameplay to make it still feel like a game and not a total military simulator. The game featured 5 levels, all set around Eastern Europe, with places like the Caspian Sea and Moscow as set pieces. Of course, the same mission-style structure is still in place, with mini-missions leading to major plot points and side quests galore. The whole game now was full 3D, allowing it to be rotated, and the helicopter now having a nifty strafe option, which makes the action even more fast-paced and intense. Missions include all the ones you've seen before, with rescues and escort-style affairs, but also a bunch of real-time missions where the story in the level shifts and you have to drop everything and rush to a certain area of the map and lay waste to whatever is there. Fail that and it usually ends the entire campaign, so the heat is really on when those missions appear. The viewpoint of the helicopter is also a bit more top and behind to give it a much more of an action approach, which works as there is a ton more enemies encounters than in the previous games. All the strategic planning is still there though, and you're really going to have to plan your route and missions for it to be a success. The graphics are pretty good, with a real digitized look to the battlefield, although there is a lot of slowdown in effect when the action gets thick. I have no issue with this personally, but if that's something that annoys you, then be warned. The music though is pretty forgettable and reminds me a lot of a generic 2000s movie with no memorable hook like the originals. The sound design though overall is still pretty good, with excellent use of sound effects in game and in those schizo MTV FMV sequences. The press totally loved this game as well. It had been long enough for the series to feel fresh again, and with the new look and style it managed to make that difficult leap from 16-bit to 32-bit, which often ended many great franchises. The series was back, but for how long? With the series finding its second wind, we got Nuclear Strike, released a year after Soviet in 1997 on the PS1. The entire team from the previous game were back, doing what they did best. John as director, Don on music, and the large programming team that was assembled for Soviet back after Mike's departure. Plot involved a madman, Lamont.
Suspects.
My best guess is it's Colonel Lamont. He sold out every intelligence agency that hired him.
Lamont. I was afraid of this.
Hijacking a nuclear weapon as the strike team goes on a full-on chase through a multitude of real and fake Southeast Asian countries as he continues to evade them, heading to North Korea and eventually the Second Korean War as the North invades the South.
Massive explosion rocked central Pyongyang just minutes ago.
The fate of the numerous foreign dignitaries attending the peace conference in the North Korean capital is unknown at this time.
Everything again is told through FMV cutscenes between and during levels, and is the same high quality MTV style as Soviet, and they are still highly atmospheric. Whereas Soviet was mostly helicopter based, Nuclear goes back to jungle style, allowing you to jump into a multitude of vehicles for an extra bit of fun, and there's a massive variety such as multiple jets, tanks, helicopters, and a hovercraft, amongst others, and that's always fun in my book, and those excursions don't overstay their welcome before you back in your Apache chopper. The game, like Soviet, also features 5 massive stages, packed with your familiar assortment of missions. One gameplay element that was introduced in Soviet very briefly pops up here also, the real-time strategy sequences where you get to control a bunch of ground troops. I didn't really like these sequences, and much like the game Brutal Legend, which I absolutely loved, and then for no apparent reason it just turned into a real-time strategy game after a while, this does the same, but to a much smaller degree. I remember distinctly being stuck on a level in the 90s for ages due to one of these missions. Luckily they are short and few and far between, but are annoying nevertheless. The best addition though is a little mini-map in the corner of the screen so you can see upcoming enemies, and the compass having an actual location direction for missions, eliminating the need to Assassin's Creed the map every 2 seconds to make sure you're heading in the right direction. And the choppy Soviet frame rate is vastly improved, although things do get a little bit chunky when mass combat situations arise. Music is also way better. Whereas Don was trying his best, I assume, to copy the soundtrack to the movie GoldenEye in Soviet to very mediocre results, this one has a great selection of Asian style ditties that at least convey the feeling of the area, but are obviously still kind of forgettable overall. I mean, I need my Rob Hubbard chorus hooks please. The critics mostly agreed it was an improvement over Soviet and another fun addition to the franchise, with only GameSpot giving it mediocre reviews, but then again it was GameSpot so you can take that with a grain of salt. Overall, Nuclear is a cool game. It's a toss up for me which 32-bit entry is better. I like the story of Soviet much more, but the refinements to gameplay make Nuclear play slightly better. Either way, both deliver the goods and are great entries to the series. Nuclear also ends with a teaser trailer for Future Strike, which was supposed to come out the following year in 1998 and would have been the 6th game in the series, with you being a future cop taking out scum in LA in your police mech unit. During development, however, the team felt that it strayed a bit too far away from the Strike series style and formula, so instead gave it its own name and identity, and was eventually released on the PS1 as Future Cop LAPD, which is an excellent underrated title that has many elements of this great series. So if you love the Strike games and want a little bit more, this is well worth seeking out. And thus the series just ended. Electronic Arts simply never went back to it. No real reason given either. But honestly, even as a big fan of the series, I think they took the formula as far as they could go, and any more games would have probably just started to erode the series' reputation slowly, just like so many other game series that have come and gone. If you've never played this series of games, then you're in for a treat. Give them a go and I'm sure you'll be pleasantly surprised. And that's it for the Strike series. Obviously these games were available on a lot of other consoles and computers at the time, but these were simply the versions that I play and loved. And thanks for joining me, Bastich B at 64K. I hope you had a good time, and if you can please like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.